You open IG app, and after checking your DMs and acquaintances' posts, go to the browser. Because even if you're not a blogger yourself, you're a worm, and Bookstagram is a place your soul feasts on, instead of reading, which used to be the main goal. Anyway, you scroll down, and it's all there. From Blood and Ash, from Blood and Ash, also from Blood and Ash. And there's a note from a threesome staring back at you, which your favorite blogger has also installed on the wall of their living room. If you weren't convinced before, you are now. It's honestly been a long time since I read From Blood and Ash, and I've been carrying the guilt that I didn't make this video, so here we are to answer the question of the decade ever since this book won the Best Romance category and Goodreads Choice Awards. Was the sex worth reading 700 pages of fbaa? It would take you 18 hours to cover the whole book, and only the amount of this video to find out. We will not be handing out major spoilers, and nothing that would ruin the books further, if that's even possible. Also, since I'm secure in knowing that my mom has yet to find a proper VPN to access YouTube, I will not be keeping things from you. It was a rather pleasant time. I had finished drafting all my series, broken all my records, and with my legacy being fulfilled, even though you have to know more about it, I felt the ease to go back to the ordinary life of a language alum, reading and studying. The book I picked was one that had been punching my eyesight with its appearance across IG, and my approach to studying was taking the chance my native Chinese teacher had given us to send in the homework we had missed before, of which I had done very few. I started reading the book at night, and it took me 2 sessions to understand that something was going to happen. I could forgive the author for blabbering about history and filling my already confused brain with endless conversations from Poppy's head about chastity if the romance was to occur at 20% in. In my day life, I wrote a list of all the reading and recording and writing I was to do, then looked at all the improvements I should have made on my Koyu, and did what every other student does while conquering the unknown kingdoms of knowledge. Planning to take measurable steps every single day of that month to both send in my homework and prepare for my conversation exam? Wrong. Getting so stressed out that my skin, for which I spent a lot for the past few months to make it glow, pouring out with pimples? Exactly. What do I do when I'm stressed? Stop caring altogether, for which I hated myself. And just to show myself how much, I kept reading the novel, rather reading a book about the history of a fictional world I did not care about, with no undersheets activities in sight. The telling instead of showing aside. Something I didn't realize at first where more characters were coming in was why wasn't it getting interesting? It was enough to let me know that all that history and world building was not going to be in vain, and the book was not gonna be just about romance. It took me a while to realize that the biggest problem, at least at that point, were the dialogues. They were bland. And it felt so weird because I realized that most of their characters and their unique voices hadn't even been crafted yet. They acted as vessels meant to distribute a certain information regardless of their personality. Which is how, for example, Poppy's mentoring guide, who struck me as someone introverted with their own secrets, ended up pushing Poppy to talk about her feelings about a topic that wasn't something new for them to suddenly want to talk about. And the reason I can point this out is because it reminded me of the first draft of my first novel and the third novel in that trilogy. While I was writing the third one, the words were rushing in my head. Why? Because I finally knew those characters inside and out. Whereas in the first book, I was still discovering these different aspects of the main characters alone, let alone the side ones. That aside, at first I was like, this is not bad for a debut author. But then I realized that From Blood and Ash was not Jennifer L. Armentrout, JL's first book. Seriously, no excuse that 25% in I still cannot care about any of whatever is happening. And I know it might not seem like that, but I'm not that hateful toward myself. So I told everyone proudly that I had finally DNF'd something. My exam also went as you might expect. It was supposed to be a one-on-one session for each person, so I literally spent 2 hours stressing over when Lao Shi would call me, and then actually surprisingly did well on the topic that I was supposed to speak on. Funny because I had prepared them that very morning, but the reading was the exact one that I had skipped because it bored me. The fact that I still remember. I'm a fucking people pleaser, if you couldn't tell. Anyway, I don't remember how long passed until, because right now I'm much better at DNFing stuff after having finished some stuff that literally didn't even add a proper escapism to my life. But anyway, back then I was pathetic. It must be the scenes I did not reach, I told myself. Maybe Jayla is better at writing them than the other parts that I read. And since the book had been widely marketed as very similar, that conclusion didn't surprise me at all. So I decided to give it one more chance. By reading the threesome and evaluating based on that whether it was worth moving down the series. I knew that specific artwork belonged to book 3, so I googled a question with very questionable wordings, and Reddit answered me, and I found a chapter. A threesome, they said. Let me tell you what it actually was. A certain character was going through a transition of sort. Their body wasn't handling things perfectly, which meant they were dying. Now, the other character, fitting number 1 from their own blood, somehow let loose of the presence of number 3 and allowed 1 to start riding them. 1 was dying from natural causes, magical causes, and the other was allowing them to be consumed so they could go together. Now, the third party stepped in, keeping number 1's jaw tight so they would stop sucking number 2 dry, and not in a good way. Number 1 miraculously started getting better and they both lived. When they got out of the frenzy, number 3 was already gone. That was it. The famous threesome. I don't criticize the author for the reaction of her audience. She had enough integrity to market her book as new adult instead of YA that certain people who also wrote explicit sex scenes did. Let me tell you what I think about this scene. I went in not knowing the hell had happened from 25% of book 1 until then. Hell, not even knowing 2 of those characters. But still, the vibe I got from that scene was not arousal. It was freaking sorrow. 2 of them were in such an emotional state and were literally dying, and the third one only stepped in to protect them and only left when they were sure things were under control. I had not cared about the main character. I didn't know what had gone on for 3 books, but I still couldn't bring myself to be turned on. It was just so dark, and not in a good way. Just like my lighting. People who romanticize this scene are either very young and are very new to the spice, or they've been too tired to look up the word threesome in a dictionary. And I'm not saying this in an insulting, patronizing way. When I was a teen, I too came across books with twisted scenes. Darkened it. I was not satisfied, so we moved back. Book 2. This one was around the end of the book. The couple were clearly comfortable with each other and in love. And things were going rather fine until they started eating while eating. I was bracing myself throughout it all. and ended up extremely traumatized for the rest of the day. So I thought that my life was miserable enough without having to go further than 25% of fbaa. Case closed. Done. Totally. So done. This is a realization that came to me last year. When life gets tough, I need escapism. One of the ways is through reading. But I've also come to realize that when I'm stressed out, trying out new books and stepping into new worlds just stresses me out even further. The book could be really good, but it would leave me with an emotional fatigue I'm not ready to add to the pile I'm already handling, or rather throwing them up and letting them fall altogether. In these sort of times, the only sort of reading that helps me is the book I'm already familiar with. The embrace of old friends. Or rather, old hags I didn't like, but now I know them and I might just know them a bit more intimately. Now that my justification is done for the judge and the fury, might I tell you that I might have actually accidentally ended up finishing From Blood and Ash? Let's get into it, I guess. Where were we? I know you've been watching until now for this, and based on what I'm sure YouTube algorithm is going to show me, will click up after this section is finished. So let us discuss something that I don't really see many people pointing out. Like, white authors creating a whole new detailed fantastical world just so that the very few POC characters they would put there for diversity would end up being servants and slaves. There are literally only two POC characters in at least the first book of fbaa. The first one you get to know is Tawny, who serves Poppy, and there is Kieran, who serves the male protagonist. It's just so beyond me that people keep writing fantasy that also happen to has all the shitty elements of a real world. And the way I see this being repeated constantly is beyond wanting to show oppression in a fantasy. Especially since the book in question, fbaa, doesn't really discuss racism and colorism, or why every single character here happens to be white except the only two who are servants. I'm also not claiming anything about the author. I do not know them, and neither do I care to. This is bigger than I or her, because it all narrows down to internalized racism. The fact that certain people with certain physical attributes need to stick together for their own safety, physical and or mental. The way you look around you and only see people who look like you, and the only exceptions would be people who are there to provide some sort of service. And an old popular writing tip has always been, write what you know, right? There's this wonderful black woman on TikTok who has analyzed this in details, so instead of blabbering, I would just put the links to her channel in the caption so you can check out her short and to the point own voice reviews on popular series. That being said, let's move back to the original scenes that were supposed to burn us, and in a good way. This time I was sober enough to skip many percentages of the book, reaching the part where many things had happened and many people had apparently died, and still didn't matter because I had not come to care for the characters. And not to mention that Poppy's never-ending self-talk summarized everything a few times. So here are the 3 key scenes that would evaluate the eventual worth of this read. Number 1. Outdoors, in a camp with guards around, temperature freezing. They sleep side by side for the sake of body hit, while he fingers her when anyone could possibly see. I would say that this was the best written among the 5 scenes I read from this series. Number 2. They finally have the ultimate experience. Penetration! Do I need to say that no talk of birth control was mentioned, or is it obvious? This scene could have been scored as a standard scene if Poppy's self-talk hadn't interrupted. I swear this girl. Since page 1, she had been constantly complaining about not having control over her life and being a virgin. Alright. As someone who was raised in a conservative society and a religious family of that, I always laugh when Western authors try to create that kind of atmosphere. Because believe me, if we wanted to dwell on this stuff, that would be all we'd end up doing day and night, and we'd also come short of time. Not to mention that nothing would be accomplished, no real fight would occur. When you are thoroughly surrounded by a culture, and it's all you've always known, with no social media to feature a contrasting culture, you're not even gonna question it because you don't know otherwise. And if your instincts are still kicking you over the head, those thoughts would be mellow, infrequent, and would be accompanied by fear. If you're the only one who's thinking a certain way, you're not gonna be so certain about them. The right way to have had this sort of conservative society and used it into a proper character development would have been to have these rebellious thoughts very infrequent at first, and then as the story goes on and she gets more daring, the questioning of her health values would get stronger. And by the time that she decides that she's in love and wants him to be her first, and she's so done that she's willing to go past the point of no return, in that moment there would be both rage at all the suppression, all the brainwashed thoughts she had held on to, and also relief that she had finally let that weight down, that she knew better now. But apart from the fact that she had zero character growth or development, tolerating her endless thoughts in the middle of what was considered, if not one of the most important plot points of the book, was really crossing a line there. Like, yeah, we got it, Poppy. The first few thousand times you said it. Something else I didn't need to read about was the constant comparison of her Lady Parts flora to honeydew. Also reminds me of a New York Times bestselling author who, in a contemporary novel, had described from the perspective of the female character the male organs of her partner smelling like pancakes. This stuff also make me feel like an alien because I yet have to smell breakfast on my underwear. Anyway, that scene ended and I read a little bit forward and damn, was I hallucinating or was there a real plot going on there? And just as I was beginning to wonder maybe the novel was worth reading fully, things turned dark and cruel in a way that definitely needed trigger warnings. She was wounded, imprisoned, and horrified at what had happened and at him, and he kept making these weird sexualized comments about her and touching her. I don't know about you, but that pretty much sounds like sexual assault to me. I don't really care if you're gonna tell me that they would end up loving each other. A teenager whose senses have been diluted is not where the bar is located. In fact, I don't really care that the book this one was so similar to had excused this in the same way. In fact, I went back and read that book, and did someone just mention teenagers whose senses had been diluted by big D's? Which leads us to numero tres. This one, a fellow bookstagrammer had told me that it had felt like rape to her. To me, it certainly felt like less dark than what she had gone through in the cell. I don't really remember much else because my mind was occupied by the fact that they were doing it on literal snow and ice. I think they were both numb after the experience. So was my brain. This was literally the first book that I rated 2 stars and didn't feel bad about it. beginning of a new era, actually. Especially because I finally took this important lesson to never trust a book that had inspired beautiful fan arts. I also came down to this realization that maybe the fact that I already spent gods know how many hours on scripting and recording this video and how much I will be by editing, all the while the great books I've had the honor to read, I will still have to even write reviews about them. It all comes back to the fact that sometimes when something is pure perfection, you'll be like, who am I to say anything about it? Or to make any content regarding that perfection? How dare I? Were there times I felt miserable enough to continue down the series? Of course, I'm pathetic. As I told you, I am more comfortable with the demons I know than the unknown. But at least as of now, and hopefully also in the future, your girl has stayed away from the drugs and has discovered adult fantasy and spicy romance. I too belong to the golden age of YA. I'm so dramatic, aren't I? So I was so drawn to these YA books that had been written more explicitly, but slowly stepping out of the line allowed me to understand that not all adult fantasies were like Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, and some of them, especially the ones written by women, had more feelings into them. And swoon-worthy romances that were actually more mature. Well, like spice is preference, but not vital. And you know what? Every once in a while, reading a book by someone who knows about female anatomy, that feels good. I'm in no way saying that there's anything fundamentally wrong with YA. It's just the way some people approach it, and the way during like the past decade that was known as the golden age of YA, agents and publishers kept pushing their authors to transition their book that was really more meant for adult audience into characters that were like 20 years younger than what would be appropriate for the story to even be legal to read. It was just not ethically correct. Because most of the stuff they were reading couldn't even be labeled as sex positivity. Because the majority of them did not discuss protection, did not discuss birth control, and if they did, there were always pills. Like something that would mess up with a female character's body and emotions. So I'm actually very glad that the age category of new adult has been established. Before it mostly used to be acknowledged by indie authors, now traditional publishers are also acknowledging it. And I'm also guessing there would be a rise in adult fantasy. That being said, I know I made lots of jokes about Poppy being in her head. I do see that as a weakness of the author, but mostly for the repetition of it. Because in real life, I would put Poppy into shame with the way my head is crowded with all of us here. The other 32 people are saying hello. Let's wrap up this video by introducing some wonderful underhyped authors who write really cute and sweet paranormal romances with spice. The first one is MC Nascosta, and the next one is Lillian Lark. Like, these two write supernatural, steamy romances that feature human and human characters, as well as real 2+ relationships. And the other one I would like to point out is Katie Roberts, who writes both supernatural and contemporary romances with added spice. And especially if you're into reading stories that do criticize something about the culture or have a dark theme in that kind, like for example coming from a toxic atmosphere like a family, an ex, these do that really well, especially the former two. And when those things happen, there is a trigger warning at the beginning of the book, so you wouldn't be pleasantly surprised. The thing that makes these three authors' work so special is the act of consent and ongoing communication throughout the whole story. I know, shocking. Healthy relationships with boundaries could be hot too. Who would have thought? Hope this video saved you a few bucks and hours of hitting your head to the wall. If you did not like my observations, power to you. unsubscribe and be on your way. Thank you so much for watching this video. Thank you so much for watching this episode on Shahrzad Stories channel. I'm Shahrzad, and I don't know if you'll see you later, but I'm only currently thinking of all the hours I would be spending on the process of editing all these, I think, 1 hour videos. So, I was not so. I was so. That's so.